Well, thank you very much, Peter, and thanks everybody here for coming. But did you see his petticoats? 6 inches deep in mud? Anyway, what I would like to do this morning is talk a little bit about food history and obviously Jane Austen, and do 3 things, really. I'd like to look at how food history helps us look at her works and sort of interpret them, something about her sort of social background, look at her characters and what the sort of food and how they talk about food tells us about them and tells us about her attitude to them. But also sort of do it the other way around, look at what Jane Austen as a writer, both as a writer of her novels and also as an amazing letter writer, can tell food historians or people who are interested in sort of social history about food and eating and etiquette and dining at the time. And my third ambition is to send you away just a little bit hungrier. In a funny sort of way. So food history it can do all sorts of things. It can look at, because it's not just, it starts with the food and it ends with the food. It's social history that you can eat. So I think what's not to love, really. But it can do all sorts of things. It can tease out those things like relationships between people, relationships between servants and mistresses, between mothers and daughters. And there's a very interesting question about, without wanting to sound too kind of deep about it, about the sort of politics of food. Who decides who eats what? It's partly to do with what you can afford, but it's a lot to do with fashion. And like all those things in fashion, clothes and all that stuff, it reflects kind of bigger, deeper trends. And it reflects something about a male-female balance, which I think is quite interesting. I'd like to kind of look at a little bit. Now, in some ways, Jane Austen seems a rather odd choice to look at in food, because she talks about it a bit in her novels, but her references are very glancing and very slight. And she's distinctly funny about food in two ways. So what I'd like to start by doing is just look at the way her kind of use of the way she talked about food in her novels developed. And I'm going to read you quite a chunk from one of her early works, which is Leslie Castle. She wrote it when she was 16, and it's written in letter form. And her heroine is called Charlotte Luttrell, who's obviously a young girl, totally obsessed by food. And this is what she says. Imagine how great the disappointment must be to me when you consider that after having laboured both by night and day in order to get the wedding dinner ready by the time appointed, after having roasted beef, broiled mutton and stewed soup enough to last the new married couple through the honeymoon, I had the mortification of finding that I had been roasting, broiling and stewing both the meat and myself to no purpose. My sister came running to me in the storeroom with her face as white as a whipped syllabub, and told me that Harvey had been thrown from his horse, had fractured his skull, and was pronounced by his surgeon to be in the most imminent danger. Good God, said I, you don't say so. Why, what in the name of heaven will become of all the victuals? We shall never be able to eat it while it's good. However, we'll call in the surgeon to help us. I shall be able to manage the sirloin myself. My mother will eat the soup, and you and the doctor must finish the rest. So I think that's a completely delightful kind of piling on the mockery and piling on the food as well. And you might have noticed here a really rare event in kind of Jane Austen's style. She uses a metaphor. And in her work, she hardly ever uses a metaphor. And anybody who can tell me the other metaphor she uses in her mature novels gets a bun at the end of this. Remind me, we'll come back to it. Anyway, but in her mature novels, she uses food in a really different way. All the people who are interested in food, who kind of talk about it, who are interested in housekeeping even, she is quite, they're not the characters we love, they're not the characters that we admire. So genuinely her heroines, so the Lizzie Bennets, the Eleanor Dashwoods, don't talk about food, they don't show any interest in it, they're too kind of spiritual in a funny sort of way, too sensible to kind of bog themselves down with those kind of earthly matters. But so some of the people who she's sort of most critical of, or kind of invites us to be most critical of, who are interested in food are 3 men, actually. One of them is Dr. Grant in Mansfield Park. I don't know if you remember him. He's the vicar. The brother-in-law of Mary Crawford. And he's obsessed by his food, and he makes his wife's life a bit of a misery. She's running around after him all the time, trying to make sure that gets the green goose that he wants cooked at the right time. It has to be after his sermon on Sunday. And if he doesn't, he gets really angry. And he ruins the whole evening for his whole party because he fancies the pheasant to be tough. He sends it back. And his sister-in-law and brother-in-law just go off to Mansfield Park because they can't be bothered to sit. So he's a bully. And Jane Austen kind of punishes him in a way. He's one of the only two people in her novels who she kills off. And she kills him off by eating too many institutionary dinners in 1 week. So let that be a lesson. One of the other people who she's very critical of is General Tilney in Northanger Abbey. And he's interesting. He's a really extraordinary mixture. He's a kind of martinet, but he's also a bon viveur. And it's a funny mixture that doesn't sit easily. And we know what he eats. We know he has cocoa for breakfast. We know he makes people eat even when they're not hungry because he feels it's the right time for dinner. And we know also that he serves French bread. And French bread is a bit like, if you've been to Bath and had a Bath, not a Bath one, a Sally Lunn, those kind of amazingly rich sort of doughy cakes there. It's like a very, very enriched bread, so it's like a brioche, really, enriched with butter, eggs, and we know that he serves that because Mrs. Morland, Catherine's mother, is worried that she's been spoilt by being served French bread at Northanger Abbey. Actually, she's pining. She's in love. It's not the food, it's the love that's done it. But we are indebted, actually, to General Tilney because he's the only time in the mature novels we get to look in a kitchen. So because he's so kind of, and I think this is a sort of criticism, he sort of pokes into the household affairs in a funny kind of way. So he takes Catherine Morland on a tour around the Abbey, and she's hoping to see sort of black, massy walls in a convent kitchen, that have been there for hundreds of years. And she's quite disappointed because what she finds is a modern kitchen with hot closets and fireplaces contracted to a Rumford, and a Rumford is the kind of forerunner of, it's the first range cooker, the cookers that kind of transform the way that we cook from late Georgian times onwards. So we actually get to sort of see a bit of a kitchen with him. And the other person, of course, who we kind of invited to be a bit scornful of is Mr Hurst in Pride and Prejudice. And when Elizabeth finds herself sitting next to him at dinner, when he found her prefer a plain dish to a ragout, he had nothing to say to her. And this is a ragout, by the way, from my book. So that tells us kind of all you need to know about Mr Hurst. Dismissed. But it also tells us a little bit about Elizabeth that I'd never really thought before until I started looking at this, that where did she get her taste for a plain dish from? What's wrong with a ragout? Is it because it's French? Is it because it's fancy? Is it too rich? And what is a plain dish? Where does that come from? At the other end of the scale, from these kind of rather bossy and rather greedy men, you get some of the women who sort of reject food in a way. So you get the people like Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility, who just rejects everything, rejects all comfort. And Mrs. Jennings, lovely motherly Mrs. Jennings, gives her dried cherries and Constantio wine, which is rather delicious South African wine, to try and kind of cure her broken heart with food. And of course, she just won't have any of it. She pushes it away. And Eleanor, who's sensible, drinks the stuff and eats the stuff just to kind of keep Mrs. Jennings happy. So there's that kind of social responsibility to eat what you're given. And the other one, of course, is in Emma. Now, Emma's an interesting novel because it's of all the novels, it's the one that's most interested in food. Food because it's about kind of neighbourliness, it's about charity, giving, and it's also got this character, Mr Woodhouse, who's fairly sort of obsessive about his food. And so Emma, of all her mature heroines, is actually the one who does concern herself with food because she's sort of got to because of her father. And she gives a gift of arrowroot to Miss Bates's, and her name has just totally escaped me as these things do because I haven't written it down, but the Jane Fairfax, the girl who's staying with Miss Bates, Jane gives her a gift of arrows and the gift comes straight back. And it's a rejection of Emma's, sort of attempted friendship, but it's also a rejection of food because she's in this horrible situation. She has no options. The man that she's in love with seems to be flirting with Emma, and she's obviously having a terrible time. So it's that kind of slightly near anorexic kind of, this is the one thing I can control, and I'm going to push it away. But one of my favourite foodies is in the whole novels, and bearing in mind that the foodies are not the characters you love, I still kind of love them because they talk about food, is Mrs. Elton, and I don't know if you remember her. She was totally bossy. She was the new wife of the vicar in Emma, and she wants to have a control, anything where there's food consumed or there's a party, she just wants to be in control of it. So she decides if there's going to be a picnic at Box Hill, she decides we're going to have cold lamb and pigeon pies before Emma even gets the chance to kind of, just disinvite her. And when she first comes to Highbury, she was a little shocked at the want of 2 drawing rooms, at the poor attempt at rout cakes, and there being no ice in the Highbury card parties, because she's comes from a very grand Bath and she's just showing them how poor they are and how grand they are. So obviously this goes down very well with Emma. And rout cakes is funny, actually. A poor attempt at rout cakes is even more insulting than it sounds, because as you can see from the pictures, they're basically little rock buns. They're not actually terribly hard to make. I'd like to put a bit of perspective about Jane's sort of experience of food and kind of housekeeping and domesticity. I mean, forgive me if a lot of you know this, but when she was brought up at Steventon in Hampshire, her father was a rector, massive family, and they probably produced nearly all their food. They were particularly proud of their father's mutton, of their mother's gardening. Her mother could dairy. She could turn her hand to anything in the house and housekeeping. So although she would probably sort of subcontract it in a way to the servants, but she'd work alongside them and they'd kind of teach each other. It was probably a very, if you had a good servant, good mistress relationship, it was probably a very happy relationship, actually. And there's quite a lot in Jane's letters about how her mother works hard at pickling hams to send with her seafaring sons, on their voyages and that sort of thing. Then they go to Bath, which they all domestically doesn't suit any of them at all. There's no garden, and they like producing their own food. Mr Austen dies. They go to Southampton, which is better. They have a town garden. And then the ladies, Jane, Mrs Austen, and Cassandra, her sister, end up in Chawton, which suited them very well. And it suits food historians very well, because with them, they took Martha Lloyd, who was a great family friend. And Martha Lloyd, bless her, kept a household book. So she wrote down all the recipes that they use day to day. And a lot of them are really interesting because they are the recipes. So one of them is a recipe in verse for a pudding. And the verse is probably by Mrs Austen. So it's a terrible verse, but it's actually rather a nice pudding. I kind of quite recommend it, actually. So she says something like, give the vicar you treat, you must give him to eat a cake to his satisfaction, and blah, 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 with all your cakes and your currants and your sugar and all the rest of it. And there's recipes for things like Miss Dubarry's marmalade, which is a very good marmalade recipe, but Jane hated the Miss Dubarrys, and she used to complain about them in her letters to Cassandra, saying their breath smelt and they were boring. But she was very involved in kind of domestic households. She was let off, as she was writing, unusually for a woman of her kind of situation, really. Her sister and her mother sort of didn't give her too many household tasks. Generally, Mrs Austen ran the house, but if she was poorly, which she quite often was, Cassandra did. And if Cassandra was away, that fell to Jane. And she quite enjoyed it. She wrote to Cassandra, my mother desires me to tell you that I'm a very good housekeeper, which I have no reluctance in doing, because I really think it my peculiar excellence. And for this reason, I always take care to provide such things as please my own appetite, which I consider the chief merit in housekeeping. I've had some ragu veal, and I mean to have some haricot mutton tomorrow. So you get a sense of what she likes. She likes stews, actually. But as she got older and possibly she got a little bit wearier with it. And I remember there was one point when she had a house full of house guests, and she wrote to Cassandra, "Composition seems to me impossible with a head full of joints of mutton and doses of rhubarb." And so joint mutton, obviously, the most commonly eating meat, doses of rhubarb. Rhubarb, it was a kind of powdered root used for, I don't know how you'd describe it politely at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, but sort of purgative, as people talk about rhubarb now. So she has this definite interest in food. She wrote this lovely, lovely thing to Cassandra when she's reporting on a new cook and saying, actually, the cook looks to be turning out quite well. I think we are in luck. And she says, because, good apple pies are a considerable part of our domestic happiness. And so she's totally realistic about how important it is. But she doesn't write about that Dickensian thing of kind of putting food on the table to kind of gather people together. She doesn't do that. So there's a kind of disconnect, really, in the way I think she writes. She seems to enjoy food. She seems to quite like writing about it in her letters. And in her mature novels, she conjures up some quite delicious food. She talks about strawberries, she talks about pigeon pies, cold lamb, white soup at the Netherfield Ball, negus, that kind of hot port, sort of mulled port. And I kind of find my mouth watering as I go through, but she's doing it in the context of mockery, always mocking her characters. And I just think it's a very neat bit of home economy, really. I think she's managing to do two things very closely together, mocking her characters, invoking food, making you feel a little bit hungry. So she's kind of having her cake and eating it, I think, in that sense. So what I'd like to do now is look at one specific event, in specific mealtime, really, at the dinner with Mr Darcy that the book's title comes from, which is at the end of Pride and Prejudice. And at this stage, I have to introduce the biggest kind of food heroine of them all in the books, who is, of course, Mrs Bennet. And I love Mrs Bennet. I think she's the most excellent character. And obviously, but she's obviously very interested in food. The first thing she asks when Mr Bennet announces that they're having a stranger to dinner who turns out to be Mr Collins, so that's a bit disappointing. She rushes off, she gets Hill, she says, "Oh, Lydia, ring the bell, get Hill to come along," and, "Oh my God, there's no fish, what are we going to serve him?" So that's what her first thing is, what to serve people. She keeps a very good table, and she's very interested in it. But at the same time, she probably hasn't taught her daughters to cook. So she knows that she is kind of involved herself in this sort of, domestic situation, but she hasn't got her daughters in the same way, because when Mr Collins comes for dinner and he says which of his fair cousins should he compliment on the dinner, she says very kind of acerbically, "We do keep a cook, Mr Collins." And so there's a sense that when Lizzie goes off to manage Pemberley, she probably doesn't have a very kind of hands-on kind of knowledge of how to produce food, which probably doesn't matter actually when managing Pemberley. So Mrs Bennet, our foodie. So foodie's she's not glamorous, she's not dashing, she's obviously not the character that we kind of invited to love or admire, but we do learn from her quite a lot about lots about etiquette, but partly because she breaks the rules all the time, and that's quite a kind of good way of knowing. And so she's obsessed about this dinner for Mr Bingley and Mr Darcy, and right at the beginning of the book, she invites them round for a family dinner. Now, what is a family dinner? It reminds me very much, do you remember that thing when in the Rebecca Brooks and David Cameron, all that stuff? Rebecca Brooks had texted David Cameron and said, "Come for a country supper." And it's that sort of slightly faux cosy, Rebecca Brooks is not going to give she's not going to give him cheese and biscuits or whatever we've got in the pantry. It's going to be a proper dinner. And it's the same with Mrs Bennet. It's going to be a family dinner. And so it's going to look very grand, but you're going to pretend, or not grand, but it's going to look very kind of sort of quite lavish, but you're going to pretend it's just what you had there in the pantry anyway. Anyway, so she's been thinking about this for the whole book. Unfortunately, after she gives the invitation for the family dinner, Mrs. Bingley's sisters and Mr Darcy do that nasty thing on him and send him off to London so he doesn't do the terrible thing of marrying Jane. So poor Mrs Bennet has to wait for a whole year before she can produce this dinner. When they come back again, they do a morning call. Now, mornings, I'll just say something very quickly about times, actually, here. Mornings was really up to dinner time. So it was between breakfast, which would have been 9 a.m., 10 a.m., depending on how kind of grand you were. The grander you were, the grander you wanted to appear, the later you ate. So morning would go from there up to dinner time. And dinner time was probably 4 o'clock, maybe, for somebody like the Bennets, maybe 4:30 or 5 o'clock. At Netherfield, in Pride and Prejudice, where they are very anxious to show how sort of sophisticated they are, possibly partly because money has come from trade and they need to kind of make those statements. They eat at the impossibly late hour of 6:30 in the evening. Anyway, so Bingley Darcy come make that morning call, and she thinks, all right, right, now is my time. So she invites them for dinner. But though she always kept a very good table, she did not think anything less than 2 courses could be good enough for a man on whom she had such anxious designs, or satisfy the appetite and pride of one who had 10,000 a year. So this dinner has got to work quite hard. It's got to feed Bingley's attachment to Jane. And it's also got to let Mrs. Bennet keep her end up against Mr. Darcy. Now, courses is very interesting, I hope. Next slide. Okay, so this is an example of, that's 2 courses. So a course to us might be, you know, prawn cocktail followed by steak and chips or something. That's 2 courses to us. This is 2 courses at a kind of quite a big dinner in Georgian times. So your first course would be, and as you can see, they're all very beautifully kind of symmetrically and elegantly laid out on the table. So your first course would have roasts, a soup. The soup would be served by the hostess and then removed, so it was called a remove. And then all these big dishes around. And then so the main dishes would be pork, you know, there'd be roast, pheasants, both game and that sort of thing. And often the vegetables, it's not true that people didn't eat vegetables, they did eat them, but they'd often be served around the dishes. So you might have duck with peas or sort of sweetbreads with asparagus or something like that. The vegetables are sometimes integral. Or they might be served like you could have a stuffed cabbage. You know, there's a lovely recipe in Hannah Glass, who will come to you later. And I've tried to make it, it's really difficult. You have to try and stuff your cabbage, but keep it a kind of cabbage shape. Somehow kind of wrap it up as you're boiling it so nothing kind of falls apart or floats away. Anyway, so that's your first course. And you'd eat not everything around the table, but things close to you. You could ask for a dish on the other side of the table, but it's not great manners, to be honest. And who serves it, we'll come to that a bit later. Anyway, so you have your first course, then the servants come along, remove it, they take away the top cloth, and there's a little bit in Emma, again, where there's a sort of slightly uneasy moment when the servants take away the cloths and nobody quite knows what to say or how to talk. And that's a kind of indication that they're not quite the right class. And then the servants come along with course number 2, which would be on your right. And you'd have fresh roast, so we got there a pheasant at the top. I can't even read this from here, actually. But you might have some sort of creamier dishes. You might have a fricassee, a ragout, and that sort of thing. And you'd have sweet dishes with the savoury. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. You'd have a few sweet dishes on the first course as well, and then more sweet dishes on the second course. So you might have a syllabub, a whipped up white syllabub, and that sort of thing. And by the second course, you'd expect your diners to be a little bit jaded, so you might try and produce something that was going to kind of entertain them a little bit, that would appeal to their eyes as well as to their tongues. So this is it's a kind of almond hedgehog, which I experimented with a lot, and the kind of recipe in Hannah Glass actually ends up with this kind of rather disgusting kind of buttery kind of custard. So I went back to a kind of earlier recipe for what's called marchpane, which is basically marzipan, shaped and cooked and then studded with almonds, quite easy to do. And this is a hen's nest, so it's a kind of jelly made of very clear jelly, made from champagne or wine or lemon juice or something like that. And the little eggs are made from flummery, which is a kind of creamy jelly, so it's a white jelly. And the straw is long, long, thin strips of lemon rind. So it's quite, children love it. It's a nice thing to make for children's parties, actually, because I wouldn't make it with champagne, so I wouldn't bother, but it's a lovely thing. If you turn it out, it looks like a real hen's nest. So there was lots of kind of designs in jelly to kind of keep people kind of entertained and obviously impressed, very importantly. So just a little bit about etiquette, if I may. This is one of the things that people get wrong on telly all the time. If you watch Death Come to Pemberley, they have these lovely, amazing food, but lovely dining scenes, and they just got the etiquette completely wrong, you know, because they had them going out of the men and women going out of the dining room, you know, arm in arm, which is what they might have done in Victorian times. But in Georgian times, the hostess you'd meet in the drawing room, the hostess would make a sign to the ladies. She'd invite the lady of the kind of the highest rank present to precede her into the dining room. And then all the women would follow in very strict order of rank. And it's quite interesting how everybody knows their rank. And of course, rank is determined by title, by money. Smug marrieds trump singletons, and age trumps youth. And I don't know about beauty. I don't think beauty comes into it. But and then the gentlemen follow in the same hierarchy. And this is interesting because it's done even in very small family groups. And there's a very interesting bit in Pride and Prejudice when the terrible Lydia, you remember, who's gone off to eloped with Wickham, she comes back married. And Elizabeth and Jane think she's going to be completely ashamed of herself, and she's not. You know, she's as wild and fearless and noisy as ever. And Elizabeth runs out of the room because she can't bear listening to her. She's so ashamed of her. She comes back to see the family going into dinner, and she sees this. When they repaired to the dining room, I'm reading the wrong thing. She sees Lydia, with anxious parade, walk up to her mother's right hand and hear her say to her eldest sister, Jane, I take your place now, and you must go lower, because I am a married woman. So interesting, that's just the family dining, and they still take this kind of strict order of rank. But at this dinner, our dinner with Mr Darcy at the end of the novel, when they repaired to the dining room, Elizabeth eagerly watched to see whether Bingley would take the place which in all their former parties had belonged to him by her sister. Her prudent mother, occupied by the same ideas, forbore to invite him to sit by herself. On entering the room, he seemed to hesitate, but Jane happened to look round and happened to smile. It was decided. He placed himself by her. So Jane has done exactly her job. Her job is to get the right man to sit next to her. And Mrs. Bennet has nobly given up a fun evening talking to Bingley, and has now obviously has invited the next most important man, who's Mr. Darcy, to sit next to her. So they both have a horrendous evening because they can't stand each other and have got nothing to say. Anyway, how am I doing for time? So gentlemen, ladies, and this was called, because it was this idea that men and women would actually sit together was so kind of outrageous, it was called promiscuous seating. Earlier in the century, actually, the men would have sat at one end of the table and all the ladies would have sat at the other, which actually I think sounds rather fun. I quite like that idea for a dinner party. And then the gentlemen have one more job to do. They have to carve for the ladies sitting next to them. And that's a real kind of skill of a gentleman. It's one of the things you need to learn, as well as kind of not falling over your sword and all the rest of it. And not too much meat, obviously, because they're ladies, they don't want too much meat. And you must offer them a toast. You might offer them some wine. So if you wanted to kind of flirt with the person sitting next to them, you'd ask them for a toast. And you'd say something like, would you do me the honour of sharing a glass of wine with me? And you've obviously remembered to drink flirt, with your eyes over your wine glass, don't forget that bit, and just have a nice time. So there's a bit in one of Jane Austen's letters, which is rather nice, where Cassandra's obviously said, oh, this is interesting. I think Miss E and Mr T, I think there's something going on. So Jane's watching Miss E and Mr T at dinner. And she writes to Cassandra saying, no, absolutely no way. Miss E had to ask for her mutton twice. So basically, if the guy next to you doesn't really fancy you, you might go quite hungry. Anyway, so thanks to Mrs. Bennet, our foodie heroine, we actually know what is served at this dinner. Because she tells us. She says, afterwards, she does at least wait till her guests have gone. She manages to get that right. She says, oh, the dinner was as well-dressed as any I ever saw. The venison was roasted to a turn, and everybody said they never saw so fat a haunch. The soup was 50 times better than what we had at the Lucases last week, and even Mr Darcy acknowledged that the partridges were remarkably well done. And I suppose he has two or three French cooks at least. And there's a kind of raft of food history packed into that little paragraph, like a kind of dim sum. There's loads in there. And I've managed to get my slides in the wrong order because I put you soup, which comes in the middle. There's the venison. Obviously, these are recipes, in the book for each of these things. And that thing about Mr Darcy acknowledging the partridges were well done. So they did have something to say to each other, one thing. And actually, it's very interesting. So, of course, she mentions venison and partridges. And they still have a sort of quite posh associations with us. But in those days, they really spoke volumes. If you couldn't just buy venison from a butcher. You had to know somebody with a deer park. You had to either your own deer park or know somebody with one. And the same with partridges. Game was quite sort of tightly controlled about who could eat it still at this stage. And Mrs. Bennet, in case she doesn't make it clear enough by serving the things on her table, she rams the point home to Bingley by saying, oh, Mr. Bingley, when you've finished shooting all your pheasants, as though she doesn't have very many, you must come up to here and Mr. Bennet will take you shooting. Because So she's saying, we are landowners. We are, the same social class as you. So she's telling them this and serving it to them on a plate. And that thing about French chefs, I think, is extremely interesting. So she talks about Mr. Darcy having 2 or 3 French cooks. And French cooks were held in that time with a kind of mixture of sort of awe and suspicion by the kind of yeoman classes that you'd expect Mrs. Bennet to belong to. So they kind of knew that they were doing kind of fancy, interesting things, and you were kind of quite impressed by it. But at the same time, they really were fancy. And were they necessary? And did you need that in a good middle-class English home? I don't think so. So a difference, for example, so Mrs. Bennet would have paid Hill around that time about £10 a year. So an English cook, we pay £10 a year. Mr. Darcy's fancy French chefs, male, obviously, female English cook, male French chefs, would be paid around £60 a year. So there was a massive kind of difference in esteem. And one lady who was very, very Mrs. Bennet-esque, who obviously sort of disagreed with this whole way of being, was Mrs. Glass, Hannah Glass, who was a little bit earlier than the time that the Pride and Prejudice kind of time that Jane Austen is writing it. But her book was published in 1747. It ran into several editions and it was in print for about 100 years. So every housekeeper like Mrs. Bennet would have had a copy of Hannah Glass. And she picks up this theme about French and English and what the kind of the necessity of one and the difference between them. And she says, she talks about men insisting on having French chefs and how ridiculous it is. She says, so much is the blind folly of this age that they would rather be imposed upon by a French booby than give encouragement to a good English cook. So there's this kind of funny French versus English thing. So if you go back to are kind of bullying men that we looked at the beginning. Mr Hurst was one of those sort of boring bullies who prefers a French dish. He wants a ragout, a French ragout. And General Tilney serves this French bread. So there's something sort of slightly suspect about them. So suspect about men particularly, who get involved in household affairs, but also who prefer kind of French, stuff to English. And Hannah Glass was very... Well, she was actually very two-faced about it, actually, because she has this whole very funny kind of introduction to her cookery book saying what nonsense French food is. And then she has many, many recipes for kind of ragouts and fricassees and all these kind of French things in her books later on. But I think what's happening at this period is, because of this kind of growing middle class and smaller households, but with servants, which are run by women, there is more of an emphasis on kind of good plain English cooking, the Mrs Bennet sort of cooking, the plain dish, the not a ragout and all the rest of it. And that question that we looked at right at the beginning about kind of who has the control over food, who decides on what gets, who gets fed what and who gets paid what. I think that was becoming sort of slightly feminized. And it's an interesting thing because it keeps on happening over the centuries. We have, Mrs Bennet, who was Mrs Beeton. How interesting, they're two very similar names. Very, very kind of anglicised, easy versions of French food, English food for everybody. And Mrs Beeton, coming into that era where the middle classes were kind of almost terrified about kind of how to control their servants and kind of keeping a distance between them. I don't know if you know, the beginning of Mrs Beeton's book is, as it is with the mistress of a house, so it is with the commander of an army. You've got to kind of rise early, have cold baths, and keep those people beneath you. That's your job. And so at the time of Mrs Beeton, there were all these kind of fancy French chefs and or Italian. Actually, the Queen Victoria had an Italian chef called Francatelli. And I feel it's sort of going on at the moment. There's all these sort of this debate in kind of English food now, which was changed obviously by Elizabeth David, who's one of those extraordinary people who kind of managed to bring the French element in, but in a slightly Mrs Bennetish way. She brought the kind of French element in, but turned it from being fancy and French into being kind of ordinary and middle class and anybody could eat it kind of food, the sort of Mrs Bennet's kind of food. So I think that battle has been going on. Now I think it's probably not gendered specific anymore, because the sort of the cookery books that the Nigel Slaters or the Hugh Ferning-Whittingstalls that you buy are very much the kind of Mrs Bennet's kind of style of food, I feel. But at the same time, there's still that sort of there's still a bit of kind of come dine with me in it. There's still a bit of sort of anxiety about what serve, even if everything you serve is the right thing, if it's English, your peas from your garden and pork from down the road and all the rest of it, you still want it to look like a family dinner or a country supper. So really my advice is if you get invited to a country supper or family dinner, just have a good look, because you might see Mrs Bennet there in the corner. Anyway, I will stop there, but I'd love to answer any questions. I hope you've got some questions. We've got about 20 minutes to fill them with. So please do. There's a lady there. Hello.
Thank you very much. I've loved your talk.
Oh, bless you. Thank you.
Who is your favourite cook now, celebrity cook, and why?
I do love Nigel Slater. I think I love Nigel Slater because of all those kind of English... Okay, I'm going to give you two answers to that. Because of all those sort of English influences in his food, it's easy, it's kind of, there's kind of tradition and innovation in it, and it's very family, it's very easy to do, and it's not fancy French nonsense kind of equivalent. But the other thing that I'm really enjoying at the moment is that there's a little bit of There's a bit of a kind of renaissance in baking. Obviously, there's a massive renaissance in baking thanks to the Great British Bake Off, but one of the things I'm really enjoying is that is quite influenced by food history. And I don't know if any of you got the British Bake Off cookery book, I think, whatever it's called. And there's a little bit of kind of, introduction to each recipe that tells you where it's from and tells you sort of one of the earlier cooks, which I think is fantastic. I'm really delighted to see that. Yeah. Hello. Yes, you. Sorry. Yes. Get a microphone. That's a great idea.
Just in your research of preparing for the book, are there any particular dishes that you discovered that you think we've lost, that we should probably reconnect with or try once more to bring back onto the table?
I think there are some dishes that we don't eat so much anymore, and like the difficult things like the pig's heads, the brawn, which were a major part of, having a pig's head on a table would have seemed quite normal, quite a sort of glamorous thing until, relatively recently. I don't particularly mourn that, I have to say. But the thing I do think is really sad is not being able to get mutton anymore. And it's so hard. It's ridiculous. I said this actually in the Lake District, and the hills were alive with the sound of mouton, and everybody said, of course you can get mutton, just go to the butcher's in Keswick, of course you can get it. So I went to the butcher and he went, oh no, you can't get it. But if you go to that farm, down that valley, over that mountain, then maybe he will get it. So that's quite but I think, I think Prince Charles has got a kind of movement to try and bring that back. And there are kind of sort of delicate kind of taste differences between now and then. They cooked in cakes and things, they cooked a lot with rose water, which I think which is basically the Turkish delight taste, which I think used sparingly has a really lovely taste. And mace is one of the other ingredients that was very popular then in savoury and sweet dishes. And oysters, obviously. A lovely dish from that time is mutton stuffed with oysters. And so it's quite sad. You could just use anchovies actually instead, because it gives that same sort of slightly fishy sort of intensity, iodine-y kind of intensity of flavour. But thank you. That's a nice question. Hello. Yes.
I know that I think probably in the modern age we all rely quite heavily on our fridges and freezers, and that's quite an energy-hungry way of cooking. I was wondering, first of all, how did their food storage facilities affect their recipes? And secondly, are there any, in terms of larders and pantries, do you think we could go back to that if we're trying to live more sustainably and be less electricity hungry in our kitchens?
You can, if you've got the time, I think. I mean, what I've discovered, and I expect what all of you have discovered, is that kind of food preparation, particularly around harvest time, around, when apples, cherries and damsons and things are there, they would have spent the whole day for weeks on end pickling, preserving, and kind of maintaining things. And it's a lovely thing to do. I don't regret having my freezer in a way, because, for example, if you have a recipe, many of the recipe books of that time, kind of early 19th century, they'll give you recipes for fruit tarts made from preserves, and then fruit tarts made from kind of fresh gooseberries or whatever. So, and there's a lovely bit actually in Emma, Mr Woodhouse, fussy Mr Woodhouse, who's trying to press some apple tart on Miss Bates, and he says, "Ours are all fresh apple tarts, no unwholesome preserves here." So he's probably right, actually, because preserves are quite unwholesome because they're very sugary. So I think if you're willing to do that kind of incredible sort of energy and time-intensive amount of kind of preserving and pickling, putting stuff in vinegar, and so they would have had storerooms. I've got a recipe in the book for Newcastle pickled salmon, and it's sort of salmon pickled with a bit of beer, actually, but also vinegar. And so you'd have had to have a high tolerance for vinegar in those days. And a lot of the things, actually, if you go back to this slide, a lot of these little dishes that you see around you would have been store cupboard things. So even though it looks like it's a dinner of kind of 20 dishes, and it is a dinner of 20 dishes, some of the tiny things would have been, you know, sort of pickled lemons or pickled cucumbers or pickled anything, and sort of things from the store cupboard. So they always had them there. So they had an amazing range. I mean, that's something we have lost, definitely, by not having them there. If you have, you can go into your, you know, you really could kind of get a scratch supper for somebody on sort of various kind of preserves and pickles and whatever you got around. But they would have had to. So I don't know, what do you think? Do you think we've lost something by having it so easy?
I think that because generally our houses have got smaller, we just don't have the physical space to keep all of this stuff. I know at my parents' house in the country, I've got the space to store barrels of apples, but in a flat in London, I don't have enough room for a bin.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think there's a pressure on how we build our houses and how we build our kitchens.
Yeah. I mean, it's just storing apples, you know, as anybody's done it. No, you need to, you know, they need to absolutely be, they're very jealous of their space, aren't they? They can't touch another apple, otherwise they'll get bruised and all uncomfortable about it. The gentleman there.
Utterly fascinating talk, thank you.
Well,
I'm Scottish, and it occurs to me, of course, that the Scots were better friends with the French in Austen's time than the English, and there's still a certain Anglo-French thing. But we're in Wales. What about the food history of Wales at that time?
It was an interesting time, actually, in Wales, because, now my dates are slightly hazy here, and you'll probably, I'm sure there are people in the audience who can correct me, but I believe at that time there was a kind of resurgence of Welsh culture, and one of the kind of food sort of heroines, really, was a lady called Lady Llanover, thank you. And she wasn't actually Welsh, was she? No, she wasn't Welsh, but she completely kind of gave herself over to this kind of Welsh culture and things, and trade, weaving and crafts and things. And one of the things she did was collect together Welsh recipes. And they are absolutely amazing. You know, one of her famous recipes is salted duck, which is still, you kind of still find in different versions and recipes today. And, you know, things like kind of Welsh cakes. And so she completely, so I think she and other people of that era were kind of beginning to kind of re-promote the Welshness of Welsh food. And I don't know, but I have a sense that it has kind of fallen off a little bit, you know, that we don't, you know, there's sort of salt marsh lamb and that sort of thing, and obviously, what's the seaweed called? Lava bread, thank you. And I find it, I have a sense that they're kind of treated ever so slightly as a sort of slight oddity, certainly in England. So I think possibly, I mean, it's lovely coming to Wales and being offered Welsh cakes all the time, and that's really fantastic. And I have a sense it hasn't quite fed into kind of the London sort of food scene in a way, but I suspect that's a matter of time. And I think it's probably the same with Scottish food as well, because there was, again, at that time, there was a bit of a resurgence in kind of Scottish food. There was this fantastic, actually slightly later than that, there was a fantastic woman who wrote a cookery book as though she was writing in one of Walter Scott's novels, and she collected a lot of the kind of Scottish recipes. And there was a kind of food scene around Edinburgh, I think, and I suspect it kind of comes and goes, doesn't it? And I think it's probably due to kind of come back, because there's some fantastic kind of Scottish and Welsh recipes. And I don't quite know enough about them to sort of to know. But I would have thought at the time, I mean, Jane Austen is interesting. She's very English, and that whole kind of anti-French thing, you can completely understand it because of all that stuff that's going on, you know, with Napoleon and revolutions and stuff across the Channel. But I think it probably would have, they were very nervous about appearing to be a bit too sort of wild. And they might have seen Scottish and French food as a bit too wild. So, for example, the picnic at Box Hill, you know, in Emma, Mr Knightley doesn't like the idea, this nightly's kind of worried about there being a picnic, you know, because if you eat in the open air, doesn't it mean that all these kind of social barriers will break down? And actually that is what happens, you know. Emma turns out to be incredibly rude and upsetting to Miss Bates, so there's something about eating outside that's a bit too close to sort of what people do in the fields, you know. And obviously people who are in the fields, they have to have a picnic because they have to eat their bread and their cheese and their bacon at lunchtime because that's where they are, but we don't want to get too close to them. And I suspect, I don't want to be sort of retrospectively insulting, but I suspect there might have been a slight feeling about that. You know, keep it nice and English and keep those foreigners out because you can't trust them. This lady in black.
Yes, I was wondering, it seems to be there's a sort of national fascination these days with historical recipes and harking back to past centuries. And I was wondering what you thought was behind this, why as a society we want to look at those old recipes now.
It's such an interesting question, and I think it's often individuals who do it. So obviously Heston Blumenthal is, you know, is a kind of like this kind of genius mind, and his kind of interest has driven a lot of interest in the sort of higher end of cooking. So if you've ever been to his restaurant dinner in London, you know, it's like those extraordinary, it's very famous for having this meat fruit, you know, something that looks like the perfect piece of tangerine or whatever it is, but is actually made from kind of liver parfait, or, you know, kind of roast pineapples and things. So I think he definitely has to be credited with some of it. But I also think, I think it's an economic thing. I think that, you know, even kind of recently with our sort of, I don't want to sort of sound too pretentious about it, but I do think when you have economic instability, people sort of draw their horns in and retreat to what they know and what is comfortable and what is sort of tried and tested. And so we become more interested in in English food or British food, with the sense that all that kind of, you know, the sort of pan-Asian and sort of international cuisine it's a bit kind of risky somehow, you know. And when there's all that kind of economic crises going on, just have some macaroni cheese because it's comforting, or you have shepherd's pie or something. So I think there's a part of that. But I also think, I think a lot of it, some of it is to do with the green movement as well, and our understanding of our sort of renewed interest in the agricultural year, because you cannot look at food and the production of food without being interested in how it's produced in the agricultural year. And then that thing about kind of food miles, if you're worried about food miles, then obviously you look at what's local and what's close to you, which I think has been, I mean, obviously there are problems of, you know, economically there are problems of localism, because you don't want to, you know, stop the livelihood of somebody producing, you know, asparagus in Peru or whatever it is. But I think on the whole, that's probably what lies behind it. So I think there's kind of three things. So it's kind of individuals, economic circumstance, and the kind of green movement, and our kind of renewed understanding, or an attempted renewed understanding of what goes on in the production of food. There's a lady there with a watch.
Thanks. When we hear about food, both in Jane Austen and even through to Victorian times, there's always hundreds of courses and masses of it. So why weren't they all obese? Because I don't think they were exercising very much. Or do we only hear about the big meals and they didn't eat much on the other days? And did they make a connection between food and health in the way that we're obsessed with now?
Okay, I'll make this the last question because it's quite long. And quite a long answer. Some of them were obese, for a start. The huge courses, you were expected to control yourself. And one of the rules I think I mentioned earlier was that you were expected only to eat from the dishes around you. So you might actually, even though there might be 20 on the table, you might only eat from 4 or 5 dishes, which is not unlike a kind of Sunday lunch today. And actually this is an interesting thing, without wanting to get too deeply into it. After this period, our method of changing food changed to what we now know as courses. So, one dish at a time. So if you'd have had 20 courses menu in Victorian times, it would have been one after the other, after the other, after the other. And that would have been a huge amount, and everybody would have eaten that, and that would have been a huge amount of food. So that's how those kind of courses, it was kind of naturally circumscribed by your sort of manners, really, by etiquette. So I think etiquette helped, could keep people in place. But at a normal family dinner, there might be, there'd be whatever you could afford. And there was an expression at the time was, you see your dinner, which means that it's a slightly apologetic expression, meaning you come down and there in front of you is a table with 2 dishes or 3 dishes on it. And it's a way of saying, eat everything now because there's nothing else. There's no more to come. And Jane uses that in the Watsons, that fragment where her characters are actually quite poor, and one of them is saying to the other, you see your dinner in front of you. They were totally aware of food and health, but not necessarily in a kind of very educated way. And there's a story which I really like, and I hope is true, although I'm told maybe not be, that the Bath Oliver was invented by a physician in Bath, because, whatever his name was, Oliver, because he'd already invented the Bath bun. And he noticed that his patients were getting fatter and fatter on Bath buns, and so he thought, I will scale back all the eggs and butter and produce this little flat little biscuit. So yes, I think they did realise that. And they obviously, there's that whole problems of gout, and people had gout and toes. So I think they probably realised that, if you ate too much meat and drank too much claret, you might be in for some problems. So there was a kind of rudimentary. And they were very conscious of medicine. And like I mentioned, rhubarb root. Recipe books are also always medicinal books as well. There's lots of recipes for medicines, which are sort of food and sort of not. Anyway, I've got a red light, which means I should probably end. So anyway, thank you very much.